Welcome to the African Lounge at the Kennedy Center. Thank you guys all for joining us. I just wanted to give you a brief orientation to what we're doing here today, and then we'll introduce people who will be here. Once again, thank you for coming. My name is Kimberl Crenshaw. I'm the Project and Development Coordinator for Arts in the Changing America. And welcome to the Shift, ArtChangeUS at Shift Festival of American Orchestras. This symposium features a lot of great artists, but what I'm really here to tell you about are these little orange cards that you may have seen on your chair. This is going to be for the Q&A portion of our event. Once you, we'll come around towards about 20 minutes before we end during the roundtable, and if you have a question anytime throughout the event, please write it down. There aren't enough pens for everybody, so if you have a leader with a pen, please share. And just when you're done, raise up your orange card, and myself, Liz, or another runner may come and grab it from you, and we'll hand it to Garrett, our interlocutor, who will then pose the question to our panel. Any questions? Great. Okay. So with that, I'm going to introduce Roberta Uno, the Director of Arts in the Changing America, and Jamie Bromis, the Director of Classical and Music Program at the Kennedy Center.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you come up with me? Thank you. Thank you, Capenna. My name is Jamie Bromis, and I have the great honor of working here at the Kennedy Center, and I get to be the Shift lead here at the Kennedy Center along with my counterpart, Samantha Pollack, over at Washington Performing Arts. And I want to welcome all of you to the Shift Festival, which is a co-presentation of the Kennedy Center, Washington Performing Arts, with a partnership from the League of American Orchestras. Each year, we invite 4 orchestras from across America to showcase their vitality and to share the unique ways that they're responding to their home communities. This year, we welcome the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra, the Albany Symphony, the Indianapolis Symphony, and Washington's own National Symphony Orchestra. And during the festival, each orchestra has a main stage concert here at the Kennedy Center in the concert hall, and then they have several residency activities throughout the Washington area during the week. So a couple facts from the League of American Orchestras. Just a few statistics. One is that orchestras large and small are active in all 50 states. There are 1,600 orchestras in the US alone, and they serve more than 25 million people. Beyond the concert hall, orchestras serve their communities in schools, in high poverty neighborhoods, and are active with both seniors and with many health initiatives. In short, orchestras are essential to the creative ecosystems of every American community. When we were thinking about this year's festival, we wanted to focus on the very important topic of equity, access, and inclusion. So we reached out to Roberta Uno, who is leading this charge nationally and with this vital work. Roberta is the Director of Arts in a Changing America, and she has put together this very powerful roundtable discussion where we will ask hard questions about the universal challenges facing orchestras as audience landscape changes, communities call out for more engagement from their nonprofits, and the art form seeks its place amidst the currents of American contemporary life. The roundtable will explore how successful arts organizations question closely held assumptions, take risks, develop cultures of continuous learning, and view the audience as a central partner in the orchestra's creative life. These arts organizations realize that business as usual is not an option, and they are pioneering change that is opening up the arts to new, diverse, and enthusiastic audiences. So please join me now in welcoming Roberta Uno to lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's some seats down here if people are hovering at the doors and want to come in. So I want to thank Jamie and our amazing colleagues here at the Kennedy Center and Washington Performing Arts. We are Arts in a Changing America, based at the California Institute of the Arts, and it has been truly inspiring to collaborate on this Cultural Equity Forum for the Shift Festival. This program is also part of the series Art Change at Kennedy Center National Conversations. And that's a series that brings together leading artists and change makers who are really advancing a pluralistic vision of America. And so, as has been done at others of these events, I do want to acknowledge that the Kennedy Center sits on Piscataway land and to recognize the historic present, and future presence of the Piscataway people. I've been asked to give some demographic overview that is relevant to the arts sector. So, you know, as we have all heard, by the year 2042, demographers tell us that people of color in aggregate, Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans, will eclipse the historic Caucasian majority. And that change is really rolling up from the next generation. Since 2011, the majority of babies being born are, quote, minority. It's kind of an oxymoron. And Latinos are the largest immigrant group, and it is projected that Asians will overtake. So this shift to what I like to call a new American plurality has already occurred in the majority of metropolitan areas and many states. And this is a great Times Lab map called Find Out If Your State is America's Past or Future. But you can see the orange correlates with the past demographics of the US and blue with its future. So for example, our facilitator today, Garrett McQueen, is from Tennessee, and he's sitting close, so he can probably actually see that his state is in 1987 in orange. If you look at the aqua-colored states and note California, Texas, New Mexico, and Hawaii are already what US will look like in 2060. So across the entire population, maybe not with Hawaii's palm trees and rainbows, but we're getting there. So there is really an enormous gap between, you could see between those different states and between what America looks like on the ground and what it looks like on an institutional level. So this was a very interesting New York Times piece called Faces of Power. And in response to the 2015 Oscars So White protests, the New York Times surveyed 503 of American leaders in business, education, government, and culture. And they found that only 44 were people of color. We just redid this research for 2018, and that number has actually fallen to 38. So I'm going to show you, it's their infographic that we've updated. Look for the yellow. And so it will show, for example, that CEOs of America's largest corporation, there have been 16 leadership changes, and yet it has dropped from 8 people of color leaders to 6 in corporate America. And that includes Delta, Exxon, General Electric, Coca-Cola, Tyson Foods, United Health, et cetera. So here we go. Those are the 6 corporations. The cabinet has gone down to 3. Presidents of Ivy League universities remain at 0. US senators actually has grown to 9. Hollywood executives, still only 1 top movie executive. Still in music, only 1 top music executive. Mayors of largest cities in America, there are 4. The people who influence books, which get published and read, 2. People who can greenlight shows on TV has actually grown, 3. Go Shonda Rhimes. 1 major newspaper editor. 2 Supreme Court justices remains the same. 3 American governors. No people of color in the top military advisors. And then the owners of professional basketball teams. There are 2 owners of color, and it's pretty much the same picture in professional baseball and football, 2 and 1. So we correlated also the largest symphony orchestras, and really it's consistent with the field as a whole. There are 3 leaders of color. We want to thank the League of American Orchestras for this chart on racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in the orchestra field. And this shows that between 2010 and 2014, there have been boards of the major orchestras are over 90% Caucasian. And this extends to philanthropy as well, this gap. This is from Holly Sidford's landmark report for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, and it quantified what we can actually empirically see. or observed that organizations with budgets larger than $5 million make up only 2% of the arts sector, and they receive more than half of its funding. And only 10% of all grants dollars that go to supporting the arts go explicitly to benefit communities of color. So as Jamie was saying before, just a few facts from the field. Thank you to Jesse Rosen and the League of American Orchestras. There are 1,254 orchestras in America. 90% actually have budgets under $1 million, and 60% of those under $300,000. They represent 100,000 performing artists. And their audiences are 25 million for 28,000 performances. So while this gap, this inequity that I've described, this lack of diversity is very real, it is a field that is embedded much closer to the ground than people might think, and very deeply embedded in communities. So this is a time of enormous social transformation and, I think, possibility. And that's why I'm so excited to hear from our speakers and presenters today. They are people who are really innovating and leading the arts around the issues of aesthetics, artistic processes, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'd like to start by bringing out our host and facilitator for the forum, Garrett McQueen. He's a passionate advocate for the diversification of the orchestra field. As an instrumentalist, he's the second bassoonist for the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, and he's a public radio host of Afternoon Concert on 91.9 WUOT Knoxville. Welcome, Garrett. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for being here, and thank you to the Kennedy Center for having us for this very important conversation. I'd like to personally thank the Kennedy Center's Ariel Elizabeth Shelton for suggesting me to be today's facilitator. Thank you. It's a great honor to participate in this way, and I hope today's presentation will shed some light on the work we need to do in the arts, as well as inspire you to do what you can to propel that change we need to see in the arts and the country as a whole. Today's conversation is going to center around three framing questions. What is the role of an institution in a race-conscious world? How do we create practices and innovations toward greater inclusion and cultural equity and participation to engage who we are as a country now? Who, specifically, are we trying to serve? Keep these in mind as we hear from the different respondents and the different speakers on today's panel. We're going to start by getting things going with perspectives from 6 very distinguished guests, beginning with Mr. Lee Koontz. Lee is the president and artistic director of the Gateways Music Festival based in Rochester, New York. This festival highlights and showcases the achievements of musicians of African descent, bringing together Black musicians from around the world to participate in a week of music, fellowship, and activism. Please welcome Mr. Lee Koontz.
Thank you, Garrett, and you're helping save me some time by talking about Gateways already, so that's terrific. As Garrett mentioned, my name is Lee Koontz, and I have the extraordinary privilege of serving as president and artistic director of Gateways Music Festival. Celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. Here we go, good. The mission of the Gateways Music Festival is to connect and support professional classical musicians of African descent and enlighten and inspire communities through the power of performance. And while I am immensely proud of Gateways and the work that we do to support musicians of African descent, I'd like to spend a bit of my time speaking with you today about some of my observations and perspectives based on my now more than 25 years in the field, and my observations and perspectives on diversity in classical music based on that experience. Like many of you in this room, I've had numerous conversations about diversity in classical music over the years. And while the number of those conversations has certainly increased and the frequency has certainly increased in recent years, the content of those conversations and, frankly, the results that we've achieved have remained fundamentally the same. So in the spirit of lists that have become so popular today, especially on the internet, I've entitled my remarks, which you got a bit of a preview to, 5 ways to avoid having the same conversations about diversity in classical music 25 years from now. 1, I encourage us to deepen the conversation. And related to that, become more comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. As a nation, we have this great ability to sweep issues regarding race under the carpet. Our ability to talk openly and honestly about race and the issues related to race in classical music is essential for our progress. For instance, our discussions, our deep discussions, our difficult conversations should be about things like the fact that black musicians, classical musicians, were denied an opportunity to play in most American symphony orchestras or even have significant careers in classical music well into the 20th century. Right? How has that affected our black communities and some black musicians? Or deep conversations about the not so blind orchestra audition process. Right? So our ability to have deep conversations about these issues will affect the results we can expect to see in 25 years. Secondly, I encourage us to rethink some of the language we use. Our language shapes and it reveals our thinking. I'm a huge proponent of saying exactly what we mean and avoiding code words, especially when we're talking about groups of people and identifying groups of people. For instance, the term people of color. What does that mean? How do Latinos of European descent fit within that category? Or Latinos with blonde hair and blue eyes fit within that category? And I bet Benjamin Moore Paints would be shocked to find out that white was no longer a color. Right? What does this term mean? Does it provide a framework for us to place everyone who's outside of the existing power structure into one convenient basket, right, so that we can develop one-size-fits-all solutions despite the extraordinary differences in the shared life experience of all of these groups? Or does it allow us to position whiteness as the norm and everyone else as the other? I encourage us to make progress in the next 25 years to rethink the language that we use to improve the results in 25 years. Number 3, I encourage us to recall our history. People of African descent in particular have been involved in classical music since the very beginning. Recalling that history, sharing that history, celebrating that history is an important part of re-engaging the black community. For instance, John Blank, who was a 16th century trumpet player in the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII. Or George Bridgetower, for whom Beethoven wrote the Kreutzer Violin Sonata. Or a group of 17th century black Venezuelan composers that I just learned about last week. The history of people of African descent in classical music is rich and it is varied. Our ability to recall that history and celebrate that history is important to our efforts to achieve diversity. Number 4, reimagine the canon. Year after year, concert season after concert season, I'm disheartened to see the lack of diversity on American concert stages. Many of you have heard about or read about the Cleveland Orchestra's announcement of its 101st season and the lack of diversity within that season. And perhaps more disturbing than that fact, we're reading some of the comments that I saw online, which to me reveal an unsettling narrative, and in my opinion, a sinister narrative that we really have to address before we can really make progress in the area of diversity. Here's one comment that I found. The reason the orchestra is the greatest is because they only employ the best available people based on ability. The article doesn't seem to care about ability, only diversity. You can have either excellence or diversity, but you cannot have both. They are diametrically opposed. Our inability to reimagine the canon reveals a level of resistance to change in our field that I think imperils not only the field, but the music we love. Programming repertoire that represents all communities is important for our survival. And 5, and perhaps most importantly, because it addresses the challenge of diversity from the root and from within, we must provide high quality, sequential, comprehensive music instruction, instrumental music instruction in particular, that begins at an early age for all children in this country, especially those in urban public schools. And unless we do that, despite the great number of wonderful Black musicians that are out there today, the incredible El Sistema programs that are doing great work around the country, or the wonderful fellowship programs, despite all of that, in my opinion, the pool will remain too small to make a substantial difference in the next 25 years. With our combined efforts, with our continued efforts, with our reinvigorated efforts, I firmly believe that we can create and build a diverse classical music field that represents the finest of our tapestry upon which our great nation was built. Thank you so much to Kennedy Center, to Washington Performing Arts, and to the Shift Festival for this great opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Lee Koontz. Up next, we have Un Lee. She's an educator, musician, and arts activist based in Queens, New York. She's been teaching in public schools and after-school music programs throughout New York City since 2012 and is currently a woodwinds and musicianship teaching artist at the Corona Youth Music Project. Un Lee is the founder and executive producer of The Dream Unfinished, which is an activist orchestra supporting New York City-based civil rights and community organizations through concerts and presentations. Please welcome Un Lee.
I realized that I had a small error. I must have sent an old bio. So my current day job is actually at the Orchestra of St. Luke's, and I oversee their LC program. So, but first of all, I just wanted to thank Arts in a Changing America, the Kennedy Center, and Washington Performing Arts for hosting today's conversation. The Dream Unfinished stands on the shoulders of many of the important institutions that are represented in today's discussion, and we are just so humbled and honored to be included. But,
Point it towards the camera.
Oh, thank you. So speaking of standing on shoulders, I'd actually like to invite everyone who is able to please stand. Now, I know there's a little bit of cheating because Lee had that slide with a bunch of composers listed. So if you hadn't seen a composer's name before, don't count that. But I am going to list some composers, and I'm going to ask that when you hear the name of a composer you don't recognize, to please take a seat. Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, George Gershwin, Scott Joplin, William Grant Still, Florence Price, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, George Walker, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, Quincy Porter, Margaret Bonds, Julia Perry. So notice why and when we started sitting down. Thank you. You can all take your seats. And thank you for the ones that were still standing. That's actually the first time this has happened before. But what did we just observe? And also observe who was left standing. But what did we just observe? You can talk back. So whether or not we choose to use that term, as Lee was pointing out, but yes, as we are listing composers who are from the African diaspora, that's when people were taking their seats. And the first time that I experienced this exercise was actually in 2016. And it was not with the names of classical composers. Kimberl Crenshaw was one of the speakers at our event, Sing Her Name. And she was listing the names of victims of police brutality. And it was when she was listing Black women that everyone began taking their seats, revealing the fight for time, attention, and resources that is existing, and whose stories get heard or don't get heard. And as we just experienced in a room full of experts in the field, not everyone's music gets heard or known. And the Dream Unfinished is an attempt to reverse this, paradoxically, by using classical music, which has historically been a white and elitist institution, to call out and address the everyday racism that exists in communities of color in our country. The Dream Unfinished is an activist orchestra. Its mission is to use classical music as a platform to engage audiences in dialogue surrounding social and racial justice. So how do we do this? Through our artistic programming, our storytelling, and our work with practitioners of influence. So as an example, in 2016, our season was entitled Sing Her Name. It featured the music of Florence Price, Margaret Bonds, Ethel Smythe, and we commissioned a new work for chorus and orchestra composed by Courtney Bryan with text by poet Sharon Strange. This year's season, Sanctuary, centers on the current and historic immigration crisis, and it does so through artists who have roots here and elsewhere. So we'll be performing works by George Walker, Huang Ro, Tanya Leon, Kareem Rustam, and Vijay Iyer, and we'll also be including a performance by Vijay Iyer and Jennifer Koh. In regards to storytelling, our performances are never just performances. So our chamber concerts have included panel discussions, dramatic portrayals of the composers that we're presenting, and musician and audience talkbacks. And our headline performances have included interactive art installations, as well as speakers who have ranged from Kimberl Crenshaw to Vince Warren to the late Erica Garner. We've also partnered with organizations such as the Center for Constitutional Rights and Black Women's Blueprint in order to further promote their missions and ongoing campaigns in this work. As our profile has grown, we've also been invited to work with student musicians, music educators, musicologists, and arts administrators like yourselves. Individuals who are in the positions to shape and influence our industry, who we hope to inspire to dig deeper, ask more questions, and ask more of themselves. We recognize that what we're setting out to do is extremely ambitious. And I will be the very first person to tell you that classical music will not save any lives. But we're all in this room here today because classical music has changed our lives. At some point, we've all heard something or saw something that demanded consideration. And through that, we were really considering ourselves. I hope that we can all continue and deepen this consideration. Thinking back to a few minutes ago when so many of us were taking our seats, I ask you to consider whose stories you've been told, whose stories you tell, whose stories are yet unheard, and what we can all do so that more of us can remain standing. Thank you. This is working.
Hopefully we can get that fixed. Thank you so much to Un Lee. Up next, we have Francisco Nunez. He was crowned Musical America's 2018 Educator of the Year and works as a composer, conductor, visionary, and leading figure in music education. He's the artistic director and founder of the Young People's Chorus in New York, which is renowned worldwide for its diversity and artistic excellence. Since its founding, Mr. Nunez has created an awareness of the ability of children to rise to unforeseen heights of artistry, serving over 1,600 children ages 7 to 18, benefiting them musically, academically, and socially through their participation in the organization's after-school and in-school programs. Please welcome Francisco Nunez.
There was this 6-year-old boy who wanted to live a life that was in many ways too hard to be a part of. Socioeconomic disparity was the wall that kept him from having friends. His given name told others where he came from. His ethnically mixed parents from the Dominican Republic and Haiti kept him culturally off balance. He loved music. He also loved math and science. But his living conditions in Section 8 housing, filled with neighbors and constant upheaval with the law, made it difficult to follow opportunities. The few programs in the neighborhood were packed with rough kids and social workers. Many children on his block didn't care if they lived beyond 18, but he did. He filled his time at home playing the piano, which his mom bought at a Salvation Army. In grade 6, he transferred schools, one where they separate the kids. The creative cluster class was on the 6th floor, basically the white kids. The other floors held the other children. He struggled making friends because neither world let him in. But finally, he befriended Christina, who invited him to her house to play piano with 4 hands. When he got there, he noticed the building took up the entire block, and every entrance had 2 doormen. They even had a guy in the elevator that pushed the button. That young boy was me. And I still remember Christina asking where I thought I would go to college. I was surprised. She had already decided to go to Brown. I learned then and there that the world was very divided. I also learned that I bring assets, that music opens doors. She, in turn, learned that talent can shine from any part of the city. My journey started in the summer of 1988, fresh out of NYU, a journey with 2 paths. On my right, I can create an artistically excellent ensemble with the mission to sing music of the masters. I would audition a very specific sound and wait for the perfect child that can afford to pay. On my left, I can go back to my neighborhood and seek an after-school program where I could take anyone that walked in. They didn't need to pay, and I would teach them everything. I was tempted to go either way, or I could do both concurrently and program a few concerts together and in some way have one pay for the other. But I was stubborn in my dream. I did what other directors told me I should not do. It was too hard, they said. Funding would be limited. Musically, it wouldn't work. The sound would suffer. But I did it. I put all the children together.
There you
go. All right. For the beginning, I had the idea to create an artistically excellent and viable choral ensemble with a diverse group of children, to bring rich and poor together, and at the same time fight racism, lead children out of poverty, harmonize the community, and build a world that is normal, what we call today inclusive. This dual mission became the foundation on which I built the Young People's Chorus of New York City. The first few years were difficult. I brought children from homeless shelters and foster care together with children from the best public and private schools, and it was very challenging to find staff. But I saw immediate success and gained amazing support. Today, 30 years later, we work directly with 1,700 choristers ages 8 to 18, performing in over 120 concerts and touring up to 4 times annually. And of course, we ask each child early on, what college are you going to go to? YPC built a caring community that is giving New York City a vibrant ensemble that has ignited the choral field. It changed the landscape with groundbreaking commissions and has been able to fight some of the underlying ills in our society and prepare our young people to become contributing, fully prepared citizens of the shifting world. YPC has now expanded its reach on a national basis with newly inspired choral programs in 6 cities and 3 countries, including programs with the Berlin and London Philharmonics. The YPC model is a successful way to create a high-quality ensemble with assets from the full spectrum of society. I'll take you through these 5 steps. mission. One that states your dream and reminds you daily why you do what you do. Membership. Rethink who joins the ensemble. Open auditions allow for a more absorbing space. Rethink the audition process. Is everyone reaching you that wants to? If they do you take a chance? Our job as leaders is to mold the assets of the sound that come through the door. Many come with natural, raw talent, and if accepted, will create a beautiful new musical sound. Repertoire that represents the cultures that surround us. Responsibility. Wrap the players with the support that they need to succeed. At YPC, if a child needs voice lessons, we give it to them. If they are failing in chemistry, we tutor them. We provide SAT and SAT courses and workshops on many subjects. All of our children are afforded this opportunity for free. But to do this, we must build a professional workforce to join us not only behind the music stand, but behind the desks as well. We need an inspired generation who are innovative and want to work in these new environments, whose music making is of the highest caliber and have a heart for the mission. We have 4,600 institutions of higher learning employing 1.5 million faculty members. Yet student enrollment in music programs make up less than 2% of the total student population. Education. We have to get directly involved in getting more children into higher learning. To do this, we need to partner and support college music programs and partner with our high schoolers and get our students ready to succeed. We need to prepare conductors and teachers to work with the privileged along with the children in need. Each year, YPC has 30 or so seniors that graduate, and 100% of them graduate from high school on time and go to college. 85% graduate from college, and 25% are music majors or minors. Our society is moving from rural to urban and back, and our cities are struggling to keep up with our growing population, which will be majority other than white. And as our economic inequality continues to be our greatest threat, I offer an alternative that has built the YPC and is now resonating across the country. Let's break the cycle of segregated programs. Let music be the beacon that brings us together. Let's make the next few years building years and bring our community along for the journey. Thank you for inviting me.
Up next, we're going to visit the world of theater with Miss Allison Carey, who's the director of American Revolutions. American Revolutions is a multi-decade initiative to create new plays surrounding moments of change, inspiration, and conflict in American history. She's also the co-founder of the Cornerstone Theater Company and has written more than 25 of the company's productions for stages across the country. In addition to this, Allison has developed hour-long television pilots for CBS and FX and has done script work for the television series Judging Amy. Please welcome Miss Allison Carey.
So bizarre. Thank you, sweetheart. It's always so funny what people choose to say about you, right? Do I? That's mine. Okay. I don't have a slide. I'm just going to use my body and my voice. So I'm going to go with that for now. Because I figured it's a podcast. So as mentioned, I am here from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, one of the largest theaters in the country with 600 employees, about 350,000 tickets moved annually to folks seeing up to 11 shows in a 10-month rotating rep season, which includes usually 4 plays by Shakespeare, as well as 7 newer works. We have the goal of being an anti-racist organization with a social justice lens and believe those values are central to the making of our art. Our art, of course, is the primary way we communicate our values to our audience. We choose stories that represent different communities and different perspectives. Our casting and creative team choices consider the cultural personhood of every artist. We have an audience manifesto of goals for our audience makeup, which took a year to develop. Our remarkable audience development department works with about 100 OSF cultural ambassadors that acknowledges that our audience is beyond who walks in our theater now, and that opening your doors is different from actively welcoming people in. Tens of thousands of students visit our campus every year and engage with our education department. We should talk, we can talk a long time, and we should, about the way reverence for the classical Western canon upholds white supremacy. But for me, that's a conversation for another day. The program I run, called American Revolutions, as mentioned, is a multi-decade program of commissioning and developing 37 new plays about moments of change in United States history, with wide-ranging writers choosing the topics of their plays, many of them untold stories, many of them old stories told anew. These plays have been produced at OSF, at theaters across the country, and on Broadway, which is not the ultimate arbiter of everything, but people seem to find that very interesting. We have found, however, and importantly, that we can't begin to be successful at our outward-facing activities, our art, if the company itself is not trying to practice the values internally. That disconnect makes the work infinitely more difficult to achieve and damages people. Our internal efforts include company-wide equity, diversity, and inclusion training, including training the board, and good training, hats off to Art Equity, who we work with. Our efforts include the hiring of a director of equity, support for affinity groups, the hiring of a more diverse workforce, the acknowledgement that hiring a more diverse workforce is not the same as supporting a more diverse workforce, developing more robust codes of conduct, and making clear that enacting our organizational values is part of the job of being an OSF employee. Most of our efforts, unsurprisingly, were begun and encouraged by people of color, something white organizations so often require of their employees of color. It's not my place to tell the story, the navigation and bravery and clarity those people had to hold. It is not my place to judge how successfully OSF has enacted these efforts. The people of color, the indigenous people, the trans and queer people, the women, the immigrants, the disabled people, and the passage of time will tell the story and judge the outcomes. The real reason I am here today, however, is to speak to my white brothers and sisters, especially white people in historically and majority white organizations, especially but not exclusively the older folks, especially folks like me who have long considered themselves some of the good white people and who often feel our noble intentions are sufficient. They're not. The primary challenge to the creation of a more just world is the behavior and attitudes of white people and their determination to uphold white supremacy. This can come through outright hostility, of course, but just as insidious is inaction that pretends to be neutral and defensive avoidance. As long as fragile white people are in positions to prevent organizational progress, and this even separate from the many larger cultural forces, organizations will not succeed. And I don't mean they will not succeed in this work, though that's true. I mean they won't succeed. So, a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the phrase white fragility? For the people listening on the radio, it is substantially less than half the audience. It's a simple idea. The term was coined by a thinker named Robin DiAngelo. And it's, the idea is that white people in this country have largely been able to avoid deep conversations about race. So we're bad at them. And when we are brought into conversation about race, our limited experience and lack of expertise often sends us into a panic. We often feel attacked. We become agitated. We go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. None of this, obviously, is a good place to have a deep conversation. I remember a turning point for me was one meeting when I was in full-blown white fragility. I was sweating. I was trying and failing to hold back my tears. I believed I was being treated unfairly, and I believed I was being misunderstood. And then I had this moment when I looked around the room, a room mostly of people of color, but white folks too. And I was the only one who was agitated. In a conversation about racial injustice, this 50-something white woman was the one sweating and crying. That's madness. One of the truisms of doing this work towards greater equity is that it's hard. It's very hard. People talk about how hard it is all the time. When white people hear those words, we assume those words are for us, which is, of course, a function of the ingrained white habit of centering white experience. We don't necessarily consider the difficulty of living in a societal and organizational structure that believes that some people's human rights are negotiable. And more than that, I believe when white people hear the work is hard, what we most often hear is, this work will be emotionally difficult for me. And that's where the crisis point comes. You may find it emotionally challenging, my white brothers and sisters. But if you do, it's because of a choice you are making. The work is hard in this way because white people make it hard. We put up intellectual and emotional constructs that deny the humanity and lived experience of our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, our fellow human beings. We value our own discomfort more than we value justice. We refuse to learn. When else in our lives do we work so hard not to learn? So, fellow white people, let the work be hard for the real reasons it should be hard, because you are engaging in deep moral and intellectual rigor. To go with a musical metaphor, not my world, no one picks up a cello and expects to be Yo-Yo Ma on day one. Read new things, come to know firsthand accounts and scholarship of people of color, of trans people, of all people who are traditionally locked out of power and our limited cultural narrative. Don't require your coworkers to educate you. Listen to podcasts, read blogs, join book clubs, go different places, keep up with the changing vocabulary. Listen to people who have high-level analysis. Practice that. Apply it to every decision you make. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors. Keep at it until the conversation sits easily in your mouth. Know that when you make mistakes, those mistakes will do damage. That hard work, fellow white people, that's the hard work of lifting your heart, filling your brain. It's the hard work of making joy. Your life will be better, and you will be making other people's lives better as well. American history and practice have taken the great symphony of human existence and silenced the majority of the instruments. Can you imagine how unbelievably beautiful it would be to hear every note? Let's work toward that.
So as we all know, the world of conducting for centuries has been dominated by white men, but Geralyn Johnson is doing her part to change this. In 2005, she made history as the first Afro-American woman to win an International Conducting Prize. In 2008, she established the Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra, which serves as a living example of what's possible when we use the orchestral paradigm to celebrate diversity. The Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra has earned numerous grants from the National Endowment of the Arts, and her innovative community engagement programs have made Black Pearl the only organization in the nation ever to win 3 prestigious Knight Foundation Arts Challenge grants. Please welcome Maestro, Geralyn Johnson.
I just want to practice. First of all, I want to say good afternoon and thank our hosts and presenters and Ariel, of course, for suggesting me, along with Garrett, for the invitation to share my ideas and experience on these issues with such innovative thinkers and artists. With your indulgence, I'm going to use the Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra origin story, as it's called, to address a number of the questions framing this discussion. About 11 years ago, I was an ambitious young conductor working in various places around the country, honing my craft with a variety of youth and professional ensembles. Like many, I also observed the general lack of cultural diversity and inclusion in our art form, and naturally, as a young African-American woman, I felt especially compelled to address this issue. And along with my colleagues, I tended to look for a unique and compelling combination of discrete elements like genre or venue, repertoire, or community that would somehow magically produce diversity. But a conversation that I had in 2007 changed this equation for me. I just completed a one-year term as a Taki Concordia conducting fellow with Maestro Marin Alsop and was taking music director auditions. 3 times I had made it to the final round and 3 times not gotten the job. At one orchestra, the search committee chairman very graciously agreed to give the unsuccessful candidates feedback if they so desired, so I called him up. He was very complimentary. "Oh, the orchestra liked your conducting and the board loved you. They thought it would be great to work with you. We just didn't know how to market you." So I asked him for some clarity, and after a very uncomfortable silence, he cleared his throat and said, "You just don't look like what our audience expects a conductor to look like." I'm going to fast forward through the whole Dark Night of the Soul portion of the origin story. But basically, the point is that that single statement shifted my entire perspective. And I realized that thinking about diversity as something that needs to be created in the future prevents orchestras from embracing diversity in the present. In other words, diversity is not a goal, it's a fact. And once my perspective shifted and I decided to start acting on instead of hoping for diversity, the entire equation changed and gave rise to new questions. The first question was simply, what do I do now? And the answer for this came fairly quickly and easily to me. I decided to start my own orchestra, and I used that experience in California to inform the mission of Black Pearl Chamber Orchestra, to take the audience beyond spectatorship to participation in the musical experience by combining artistic excellence with cultural diversity and innovative community engagement. First, I addressed the need to operate in today's society by embedding diversity and inclusion in the orchestra's very DNA, including the board, staff, repertoire, and most importantly, musicians. Philadelphia is an ideal base to scout out and employ the finest musicians of color in the country, trained at the Curtis Institute, Juilliard, Peabody, and other world-class conservatories nearby. Second, I turned the statement of "you don't look like a conductor" on its head and decided to make everyone look like a conductor. This in-reach philosophy of, community engagement gave the audience hands-on access to the orchestra. So now that I had this orchestra that started with institutionalizing diversity and then took an inclusive in-reach philosophy to make the boundaries between the orchestra and the audience more fluid, where was this all leading? What was it all for? This was the second question, that if diversity is not the goal, what is? For the second question, the answers only became apparent after years of programming, building relationships with other organizations, and developing and studying our audience. With this increased dynamism and reciprocity, I began to see that what Black Pearl was working toward went beyond a redistribution of opportunity, funding, and access to ensure that every single person had exactly the same thing. In other words, it went beyond equity to greater abundance. The kind of greater abundance that comes from sharing a unique, inspiring musical experience that makes everyone richer. For the orchestra, Black Pearl's audience of 53% African Americans and 36% European Americans actually reflected the demographics of Philadelphia, the city we served, which has roughly 65% people of color. I know that's now a term that, For the community, we learned that audiences loved seeing all kinds of people included in the orchestra, and that alone empowered them to engage their own creative capacities, even outside the concert hall. So for me, the role of cultural institutions in a race-conscious world is to fulfill the democratic vision and ideals upon which this nation was founded in the 18th century. And that means they have to go beyond, That means they have to go beyond just espousing those ideals to truly embodying and enacting them. To do that requires orchestras to make a crucial paradigm shift from reductionism to relationism. That is, we need to stop thinking of diversity as a product that arises out of an optimal combination of discrete components to viewing it as a basis for inviting and nurturing a more dynamic and reciprocal relationship with our specific communities. And once that paradigm shift occurs, we can better reimagine the role of the orchestra in 21st century American society, from being gatekeepers of an artistic product to facilitators of the creative process. I want to thank you for listening to my story, and I really look forward to exploring the exciting opportunities for creating greater abundance for orchestras in the communities that we serve. Thank you.
Our final perspective speaker today is Mr. Ian David Moss. He describes himself as a big picture thinker specializing in the alignment of evidence and strategy within large institutions and across complex ecosystems. He's the new founder and CEO of the organization Create Equity, which has produced nearly a dozen intensive research synthesis investigations, monthly arts news roundups, and regular spotlights. They were even awarded a first-of-its-kind prize for the world's best arts research. Please welcome Mr. Ian David Moss.
See if we can get this working right away. All right. So I want to start by acknowledging and thanking Un and Lee in particular for kind of challenging us to lift up and recognize the contributions that musicians of African descent and other musicians of non-European descent have made to classical music over its history. I think it's important, though, to kind of acknowledge a basic reality, right, which is that the symphony orchestra was created as a concept by white people, right? There's some debate about which orchestra is the world's first, but all of the candidates, trace their roots back to Northern Europe. And classical music was imported to the Western Hemisphere and other parts of the world by white colonizers and was very much kind of embedded in the history of white supremacy that unfolded in European countries and their colonies over the course of time. So in some sense, it shouldn't be that surprising that the League of American Orchestras has conducted research indicating that the proportion of white musicians in orchestras in the United States in 1980 was 96.6%. And you can see that in recent years, that number has gone down some. But the truth is that almost all of the growth among orchestral musicians of color has come from people of Asian origin. And the United States population, just to put it in perspective, is almost 30% Black or Latino right now. And despite more initiatives than ever before to diversify orchestras, the proportion of Black and Latino musicians in American orchestras right now is just 4%. And that number has hardly changed in a decade, and I think that's kind of the more important story. And it's a similar story with board members, executives, audiences, and so forth. So I think it's important to ask the question, why is it that these efforts are yielding mediocre results? And in this rush to diversify, has anyone actually asked what people of color in our communities actually want? So some of you might know that for about 10 years, I ran a think tank called Create Equity. Create Equity's mission was to understand the most important issues in the arts and what we can do about them. And our research agenda was premised on the idea of promoting a healthy arts ecosystem, which in our eyes would maximize the ability of the arts to improve people's lives in concrete and meaningful ways. So that entails a number of lines of inquiry, like what evidence do we have that the arts actually do improve people's lives, and under what circumstances? And we also looked at ways in which the arts ecosystem is not living up to its potential by not including everyone equally, or not giving folks a fair shot at the cultural opportunities that they deserve. So we began our inquiry into cultural equity in part with this in mind. We wanted to understand the history of cultural equity activism and the impact that it's had on the sector. But the more that we delved into that history, the more we realized that there is not one definition of cultural equity that everybody agrees on. People are having these conversations ostensibly about the same issue, but we're operating from wildly different assumptions about what success would look like. And we came to the conclusion that the most valuable contribution that we could make as a think tank would be to create a taxonomy of these different visions, to disentangle them from each other and bring them out into the open so that we can have more productive conversations about them. So this is the framework that we came up with after several hundred hours of reviewing the literature. The first division is diversity. For diversity, success means mainstream institutions in the language of that vision means a community's bigger budget orchestras, but also presenters, art museums, et cetera, becoming more diverse and reflective of their communities. Diversification can happen along a number of dimensions, including audience, programming, staff, and leadership. In the United States, diversity conversations tend to focus on race, but can also incorporate other forms of difference, such as age, gender, ability, and so forth. The second vision is prosperity. The prosperity vision takes diversity's belief in the power of organizational scale and it applies it to institutions started and led by artists of color. And these institutions follow the standard model of growth. Cultivating a wide audience, a fundraising board, diversified streams of income, all with an eye towards long-term sustainability. So the recently opened National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. is a really great example of the prosperity vision in action. Also, and if any of you know the Alvin Ailey Dance Institute in New York. The third vision is redistribution. And advocates of redistribution argue that people of color, rural communities, LGBT communities, others are socially and economically marginalized in society and therefore have less access to wealth to support their work in the arts. And so redistribution is about restoring equity by increasing the proportion of funds going towards organizations originating in and serving those marginalized communities. And so for advocates of redistribution, the focus really is on shifting the funding paradigm in a way that kind of acts as a form of cultural reparations for the wrongs of the past. And the fourth and final vision is self-determination, which calls for communities of color to claim full ownership of cultural life in those communities through the models that originate organically within them. So to advocates of self-determination, the legacy of racism and class hegemony that shaped the current nonprofit funding model and system is still very much alive today. And because of that history, self-determination questions whether people of color could ever feel truly welcome engaging with organizations like orchestras, regardless of changes to programming or diversification of staff. And resolving those inequities requires moving beyond redistribution to dismantling the inherently racist elements of the system and creating alternative structures outside of it. Now, you can probably see right away that most of the dialogue that we have about cultural equity in the orchestral world lives in the realm of diversity. And most of the conversations that we have around getting more people of color on staff, in the boardroom, on the stage, all that's fundamentally about diversifying this historically European art form. But as you can see from the perspective of the other visions, that's actually not nearly enough. And it's important to understand here that diversity is the only vision of cultural equity that really deeply prizes integration. We're in love with this idea of people putting aside our differences, coming together in a common unity. But this expectation to share and share alike is asymmetric because, especially in a context like classical music, it's an invitation, but it's an invitation that conveniently overlooks how in a white society, oppressed groups have often been denied the right to meaningful control of resources, traditions, and spaces that they can call their own. And the prosperity, redistribution, and especially self-determination visions all incorporate elements of ownership based on common heritage and identity, with no explicit obligation to be inclusive towards other cultures within those contexts. So this tension between equity and integrated spaces is crucial to the conversation we're having, I think. The classical music establishment wants to make classical music more diverse, which means making it more integrated. But what many cultural equity advocates have told me in the context of creating this article with my colleagues and also in future workshops that I've done since then, is that they want orchestras to embrace and own their ethnic roots. As they see it, the whole system and tradition of classical music is an incredible creative and technical achievement that happens to be rooted in a very specific cultural context. And to them, when we use a term like culturally specific organizations, has anyone heard that term before? To them, that includes symphony orchestras. And it's not at all obvious to them why certain culturally specific organizations, like orchestras, deserve such a disproportionate share of philanthropic support compared to other culturally specific organizations. And in fact, they think that it's pretty obvious that the share is out of whack. Now, a frequent rebuttal to this line of argument is that culture is malleable and changes over time, and we shouldn't essentialize by race. And I agree with that. And as is obvious from the presentations that we've heard today and the people in this room, that many people of color do choose to make classical music an important part of their lives. But the statistics that I shared earlier point to a larger truth, which is that even if it may be a little strong to call classical music a white art form or orchestras white institutions, it would be pretty accurate to call them white-ish. So put another way, I don't know how realistic it is to expect that they'll ever become completely representative of the diverse communities in which many of them are located and that many of them serve. And so I think orchestras in this position have an important question to ask themselves. Is our foremost loyalty to our art form and all of its traditions, or to our local community? And in answering, boards and executives need to realize that true commitment to the latter could mean dramatic changes, changes that would make their organizations unrecognizable to the individuals that founded them in a very different historical context. But on the other hand, reaffirming primary commitment to an art form with clear ethnic roots would be a signal to the world that the organization's diversity and inclusion efforts have some limit to them, right? Because the art form is what takes priority in that scenario, right? And so if that's the case, then that may make it untenable for organizations like that to go after large sums of money from foundations and government agencies on the premise of being a local, quote unquote, anchor institution, right? So my final question for you is this: what would it take to cast orchestras, honoring the invention and history that went into them, and seeing them as open and welcoming to all who wish to participate, but crucially also only one small part of a much larger and that much more glorious tapestry of cultural expression in our communities? Thank you.
So thank you so much to each of our prospective speakers. We're now going to shift and open up the conversation to our roundtable respondents. So as I call your name, please come up and take a seat here on our panel. First, I'd like to welcome David Allen Miller, Music Director of the Albany Symphony. Gary Gensling, Executive Director of the National Symphony Orchestra. Ravi Rajan, President of the California Institute of the Arts. And Alex Lang, Principal Clarinet of the Phoenix Symphony Orchestra in Phoenix, Arizona. And also, if our speakers could also join us up here, please. All right, so Alex, I actually want to start with you. When we include Asian Americans in our national statistics and demographic research, but they're very well represented in professional orchestras, not only here in the U.S. but globally. I'm going to go back to one of our framing questions: who are we trying to serve
in orchestras?
And concerning the diversity within symphony orchestras.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who even the we is, right, in terms of who are we talking about. For me, a more interesting question, if you'll allow it,
please,
is who are we allegiant to, actually, rather than who are we trying to serve. I think that would give us some more information about why we make the choices that we do and how we make them. And due deference, I want to give credit to my brother, Justin Lang, who put that question to me recently, and it's given me a lot of food for thought. You know, if you look at when does the phone for the executive director or CEO ring with a board member saying, we got to do something about this, we have to say something about this, what are those issues that motivate board members to pick up the phone and compel the organization into action? I think those are perhaps very different issues in the case of Unli's organization than it might be for my own organization. So I think for me the question of who we're trying to serve is interesting. I think actually a precursor question is who are we allegiant to? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that also touches on some of the things that were brought out today by some of our speakers about the relationship between this art form and imperialism and colonization and white supremacy.
Yeah, and I'm definitely we're gonna touch on that here in a bit. David, I want to turn to you. What is your response to the Cleveland Orchestra's upcoming season?
Oh, I'm disgusted by it completely. Now, you know, I run a relatively small budget orchestra in upstate New York in Albany. Our budget's about $2.7 million. So Ian David, sort of your discussion, I'm happy to say, I assume applies almost not at all to my little scrappy entrepreneurial endeavor in upstate New York. I mean, it's true that we would love to be more diverse, and that diversity is an issue across our organization from every metric: audience, people on stage, staff, etc. But my orchestra, I have to say, the other thing that kept coming up, and I just want to congratulate all the presenters, because I thought that what you talked about was so inspiring and inspirational, and it just sort of gave the lie to this idea that orchestras are these moribund, antiquated institutions. I take a lot of issue with this term classical music. I don't even use the term. I find the whole term terribly uncomfortable, because my orchestra does 60 or 70% music by living composers. And that's mainly what we care about. We care about the great tradition and the history and how we got to where we are from the past. But I think there's so much garbage that goes along, just bad stuff that goes along, preconceptions, misconceptions about that label. And so we, like these great institutions that have been represented here, we really believe in embracing the present and the future, particularly of composition. Mm-hmm. And so we're working with all sorts of composers of all kinds of backgrounds. Rina Esmail, this great Indian, half Muslim composer. We've got a piece by Derek Spiva, a great African-American composer in California coming up, and one by Carlos Simon, another great African-American composer. We work with a whole very broad group of different composers from all walks of life. And so to me, orchestras like the Cleveland Orchestra that can't seem to find a way to put any American composers, let alone any living composers, let alone any composers of color on their season, they have no resonance to me and what I believe and what I do and what I care about. So I really don't even consider them. I think they're really just a dinosaur.
Yeah, yeah. So Gary, you're the executive director. Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that.
Sorry.
Gary, you're
Every year I want to respond to those
Yeah.
blogs. I never do. That's my response.
You got your shot.
Yeah. I always want to say, me too. I hate that.
Gary, you're the executive director of the National Symphony Orchestra. When I think about nationalism in classical music, I'm thinking about folks like Beatrix Smetana and all of these composers who really did a great job of representing their nation through music. In the year 2018, the word nationalism is a little different. It has a different ring to it, so to speak. How do you approach this in your role with the National Symphony Orchestra? What does that mean to you?
Well, I think the question is that we've been talking about, especially when you look at the larger sort of, let's call them the legacy orchestras, right? Is all about one word. It's about change, and it's not only in the orchestra field, but in any field. Where the larger, more established institutions have to grapple with how to change. All you have to do is look at the map that Roberta put up at the beginning to see how the demographics of our country are changing. And so we have to change, not to check a box under diversity, equity, inclusion, but to survive. And I think that was the point that we've heard again and again. And we see examples here today of folks who are creating new, thriving ways to approach orchestras with none of that legacy behind them. But I think one of the things I think that's important to look at, and I've worked for 4 or 5 different orchestras in different cities, and have found different approaches on how orchestras are experimenting and trying to change, to address some of these issues that are facing us in changing demographics. I think for me a great example to sort of highlight the kinds of change, and we can debate whether it's enough. If you looked at the National Symphony or any major orchestra 10 years ago, you would look at an orchestra that week after week was doing 3 or 4 subscription concerts. That was the model. If you looked at the National Symphony actually over the past 10 days, here's what we did. Last week we did 2 sold-out performances with a group called Black Violin, two violinists who were classically trained but were mashing up classical music with hip-hop and soul music. Yesterday, we sent the orchestra into a school in Prince William County to play for a group of students who were unable to come to the Kennedy Center, and they really wanted to experience the National Symphony, so we did an in-school program. This week, as part of the Shift Festival, and we're looking at all the different ways orchestras are engaging with their communities, we're sending musicians into local Central Union Mission, into cemeteries, the zoo, to play chamber music. We'll be doing a free concert with our music director, and then we'll end the week with a concert with our music director for a deeply personal program that he crafted to sort of showcase the orchestra. That kind of schedule was unimaginable in orchestras, I would say, a decade ago. And I think it's just an example of the directions we're heading to try to change, to sort of address ways that we can connect with our communities in new and different ways.
Yep. So Ravi, I've never worked in academia, but I imagine that it's easy to blame the lack of diversity in a school on the applicant pool. My question for you, where do you see your responsibilities starting when it comes to diversity at CalArts?
Good question. I'm new to CalArts, and one of the remarkable things I found in this first year on the job is that 51% of the student body at CalArts are students of color. If you, and this might be true of many schools, particularly music schools, but if you remove the international students, the number is 41%. Now, I shouldn't be surprised by that, right? It's indicative of Los Angeles, it's indicative of this country, it's indicative of all sorts of things. But we are an institution that, as many are, is not cheap, is an expensive institution, and it's small private institutions that often focus on the arts are ones where the cost of attendance is quite high. So one of my first objectives is to think about the correlation of how much it costs to get one of these excellent educations in one of these institutions, and how that prevents access from happening. But CalArts is a very special place. You spoke of picking up the phone with the board chair or the board and getting a board member to say something. My chair of my board picked up the phone and called me and said, what are we going to do to diversify the trustees? What are we going to do to diversify the faculty? Because you got 51% students of color, and you don't have 51% employees of color at the institution. We don't have 51% board members of color. So that's his own internal challenge, right? I'm lucky. I mean, I'm lucky that I have come into an institution that was like that, and I'm lucky that I have people around me who are leading the institution who are seeing that kind of change. But I think we have to live it. I think that the economics of this country, which was borne out by some of the analysis you saw earlier in terms of a small percentage of the organizations which are primarily white serving are ones where a big majority of the philanthropy and the money are going. It's also true, I think, in these, if you overlook how expensive it is to go to these schools, it's the same kind of problems. We have a program called the Community Arts Partnership. It's another wonderful thing that has 46 nodes around the County of Los Angeles that provides free access to arts education for students. And it was born about the time the LAUSD decided to defund the arts in the public schools. So it was CalArts' response to a very real problem. It probably doesn't surprise any of you to know that particular program, we've been doing it for many years. We're coming on an anniversary. And we decided to analyze some of the results. I mean, we knew it in our heart. We knew that CalArts was focused on storytelling, on incubating the voice of individual artists and how that's done, and being able to give that to those communities was so important. We understood that, but we asked a few questions like, well, how effective is that? So we took one of our nodes, which is the high school in South Los Angeles. We said, well, what's the four-year graduation rate from high school there was 46%. So what are the kids that have been going through the CAP programs in there? It was above 90, it was like 91, 92%. So you see that kind of direct effectiveness, and it's really just giving students, giving young people the opportunity that their voice matters, that they have power to shape the dialogue. You know, and we saw the graphic about the influencers within Hollywood and the influencers within culture making, and so the people that are in those sort of decision-making places don't have that great diversity yet. But you asked what the role is. The role is getting each and every one of those students and making sure that that opportunity is broad as possible. For a small institution, that's hard. I'd love to be able to give that to every student in all of Los Angeles County. And that's sort of one of the goals in my mind. What kind of partnership is it going to take to get that done?
Yeah. So before I open up the entire panel to my next question, I just want to remind you that you have the orange index cards, the orange note cards, if you have any questions, or if you're listening remotely, if you have your questions, I think we have it set up for me to receive those, and we'll present those here to the panel. So Ian, I want to go back to something you said. So when you were presenting the idea of orchestras and classical music as, as a historically white thing, a white invention, my initial reaction was, well, once upon a time basketball was all white and football was all white. So, do you really think that's an excuse for what we're seeing right now in classical music?
I mean, so this is, honestly, I struggle with that a lot, like with the answer to that. And I don't feel like it's, obviously my place to say what the ideal outcome is. My orientation to this is to just try and kind of understand what different people are saying about it and kind of report that. But I think that this is something where I see people from different perspectives that are not necessarily kind of cleanly defined by, race and ethnicity, for example, having very different opinions about it. I had I sort of hosted a discussion about these topics on my Facebook page, in preparation for another conversation last year, and I was really struck by how there were people who were on the one hand kind of saying that classical music is every bit as much of a white art form as hip hop is a black art form, and that those kind of origins should be respected, and anything else is kind of sort of not really looking beyond the bounds of that, and this was being stated coming from people of color in my feed. Versus, there were other people in that same conversation who were kind of pointing out that there's like not a ton of distance between that perspective and the perspective that is sort of a white nationalist might take. It's kind of saying like well these art forms are only for these people and so forth. So I think that there's a lot of untangling to do there, and I think that one of the most important things is to kind of understand how, how the process of grappling with an art form that has or a cultural tradition like basketball that has roots in a certain historical context, and how that can change over time. I think, and what the relationship between that transformation and sort of the broader overall kind of state of power distribution in society, those seem to be the really kind of important focus areas of the conversation.
Jerry, as our conductor of color, do you have a response to this?
So, yes.
I'm not surprised.
So there's a couple of things. Just in your question, let's think of the role of institutions in society, because let's be clear, institutions and organizations from a sociological perspective are two very different things. Institutions have a role in society of upholding and protecting cultural values and norms and certain sets of behaviors. And so not all organizations are institutions. Sport is an institution, basketball is a sport, but that doesn't mean basketball is an institution. And so from that perspective, I think expecting sports to have the same kind of institutional stability and rigidity that you would have as a cultural institution are two very different things. So I think just comparing sports to classical music or an orchestra and that framework are a little bit different. And so from the standpoint of an orchestra as a cultural institution, what orchestras have been doing and why we're having this conversation is that orchestras have been upholding the cultural norms, traditions, and values of 19th century America. And so that's why we're having these conversations now. It's not the tension that the art form itself arises out of Western Europe or that kind of thing. It's that the values of the institution as it functions in American society are upholding outdated American values. And those values, as have been stated by so many people, have been white supremacy and Western European cultural hegemony. So to the point that Black Pearl and the Dream Unfinished and Gateways and other organizations like Sphinx and other organizations have come to realize is that what we can do, to Alex's point, to whom are we allegiant? We are allegiant to the beauty of the art form itself, but in our ability to transform the organization from an institution that upholds older values to an institution that upholds current American 21st century values. That is why we're here today. And so that that's my response.
Yeah, Alex, do you have something to add there? It looked like you wanted to say something.
No, I'm just listening because it's one thought that comes to mind is I still think we should be careful not to sidestep how it was that orchestras were bestowed this identity as institution, which we all sort of, oh yeah, that feels about right, they're institutions. But like, how did that come to be? So I think that's worth examining. And you know, the question for me, you know, becomes, you know, for whose benefit are we talking about here, right? So I think there's absolutely, as someone who makes their living playing for an orchestra, I think orchestras really need to change. They need to increase market share. They need to increase, you know, donated revenue, earned revenue, all kinds of ways, all kinds of things, right? I work for an organization that, you know, credit to the wonderful people who work there. We make our entire budget every year, right? We have just about zero endowment. We make 50% of our revenue of an $11 million budget off of ticket sales and the rest through our community. So we have a need to access more and more of our community, both to have them want to buy tickets, both to have them want to support us and to feel like we're a valued member of the community. I think this idea that there is some injustice being done to black and brown people or women by not being, collectively, not individually, collectively, by not being allowed into orchestras, perpetuates an idea that an orchestra is the destination of all art forms. It's this notion of classicality, that every organization or art form wants to grow up and be classical or be like us, and that we are in these vaulted positions, and our temples occupy the most profoundly sought after and expensive real estate in every city, right? Even Albany, I would probably guess. That, how did that come to be? They do in Phoenix. I'll just talk about my orchestra. It does in Phoenix. It's right. It's prime real estate. So how did that come to be? Those questions still remain.
Yeah, Lee, I wonder if you can speak to what Alex was saying concerning the notion that you know, the orchestral field is the top tier of it all. The participants of the Gateways Festival come from all different walks of life. You do have the professional orchestral musicians, but you have the soloists, and then you just have the entrepreneurs who play instruments.
I'd love to go back a little bit and talk about this perception of orchestras as a European thing, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry about that, Garrett.
Oh, please, no, please.
But it disturbs me, just as it disturbs me about the United States. And it's about the importance of recalling history. There are people in this country who believe that our wealth, our influence, our importance in the world was gained by whiteness. And the fact is, we took land, we stole land from Native Americans, we enslaved millions of people, and that's the basis of the wealth of this country. And I think the same is true of this thing we call Western classical music. It did not develop in some hermetically sealed vacuum without influences from the rest of the world. There was a time when North Africa and the Middle East was the cradle of civilization, and people in Western Africa, or Western Europe, were in caves almost at that time. So how did people from North Africa and the Middle East, the cradle of civilization, influence Western Africa? How did, I keep saying Western Europe, right? Yeah. And this upsets me so much, as you can tell. And how did that influence the music? So this music, I say, is universal because it has drawn from the human experience, from time immemorial. It belongs to all of us, right? So I had to say that.
Yeah.
Remind me the question again.
No, that was so great. I think I forgot the question I asked you.
It's not, but
I will ask you a follow-up question. With all of those things in mind, can we say that classical music has intrinsically racism in it? And that's for anyone.
The music itself is free of racism. The music itself is free of bias. The music itself is free of...
I'm sorry, except for Wagner. I mean, let's be real.
And if I can...
I only say that if you just take the music and regardless of the composer, the music lives. The music is something that's the pureness. It's the stuff we put around the music.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
I think you've got to define, we keep saying classical music. I have a problem. I don't understand what we're talking about in this conversation because we keep saying classical music. I don't understand the definition. So to use your methodology, I think we have to go back and define what we mean when we say classical music. Because what you're describing to me is music. It is human expression.
That's right.
Period.
That's right.
Right? That's not racist, right? Classical music might be. I mean, if we define classical music to be an extension of something that had its genesis of, right? But it really has something to do with the definition of what we're calling classical music, right?
Well, as I'm hearing this conversation, I don't want to be an orchestra. I'm a chorus. But I love working with orchestra members and musicians.
Some of your best friends.
So
right?
I love it.
We're old friends.
Yes. But music can have influence in how we think. Now, in the orchestra world, you don't have as many words as we do when we sing, unless we're singing Meredith Monk. We are singing words, and words mean a lot. If we're going to sing a Stephen Foster song, a folk song, it's a children's folk song. It depends where you sing that. It can bring back certain feelings to an audience. So it's my responsibility to decide, will I sing that song? It's a children's folk song today. Well, where does it come from? What's the context behind it? Same thing with the national anthem. It's becoming something that may divide us. So music may not be the word racist that we're talking about, but it can be used to bring people together. It could also be used as a way of separating us. And it's our responsibility to decide, how is our music being used in context? Are we going to use it for learning, or are we going to use it for power? And that's what I think that we have to consider.
Allison, I want to bring you into this. When I asked if orchestral music, instrumental music has any intrinsic racism in it, when I think about Shakespeare, when I think about, for example, Titus Andronicus or Othello, there are racial issues with those historically. How do you think we should deal with that today in the 21st century? Or how do you deal with it, maybe I should ask.
That's a very big question that we struggle with every day. And yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to be a theater who has the name of a person in the title, Oregon Shakespeare Festival. And there are many people in our audience who revere the works, and there are many people in our audience who respect the work, which is slightly different from revere. You look at Titus, you look at Othello, you look at Merchant of Venice, you look at Taming of the Shrew. The list of problematic questions and answers that the plays pose is enormous. And what I think the field has generally done and continues to do is say, well, the language is very beautiful, and we believe Shakespeare is a really smart guy who must have actually understood what he was talking about. That is not necessarily true. Obviously, we do not know what his intention was. And so we take what appears to be the position of the play, and we change it, right? We interpret it. We change away from traditional casting. Well, traditional casting is pretty much all white. And we create concepts around the production that undercut, say, in Taming of the Shrew, the last speech about, I'm going to, put my hand under your foot. And that's the way our field deals with it. We try and produce the things while simultaneously undercutting the problematic parts. That's a very tricky needle to thread, right? Because you are actually, even though you are saying you're undercutting, you are propagating a lot of stuff. We're producing Othello right now, and we're now, we have not sort of completed the process, but we, many of the women in the company said, well, in the process of producing Othello, we have to 120 times experience the death of Desdemona. People who are working on the cruise, people who are triggered by the reality of domestic violence, people are triggered by the racism in the production. So then you get into this question, not only, you talk to your audience and how do you take care of them, but how do you take care of the company as you continue to produce these works which are problematic in their core. And there are people who love Shakespeare who don't think that, but you know, I do. And I think a lot of people, and you know, we're going through an artistic director change, and there was somebody who brought up a question at a meeting, which was, how long should the Oregon Shakespeare Festival continue to produce Shakespeare? And Shakespeare's not going anywhere, I don't believe, but there are a lot of, you know, the idea of a canon is problematic in itself. But when you have the canon so based around Western artists of hundreds and hundreds of years ago, you're shutting so many doors. And so I think we have to unroll the idea of a canon entirely. And, you know, this is what we do, right? We get to decide what's important in our culture. And I think the centrality of the canon is something to be challenged daily.
Thank you. So I think it's time for us to open up the floor for questions. Thank you. Okay, this is a question from online. How do orchestras retain audiences who may not have felt previously welcome in their spaces? So basically, maybe I can rephrase this question by saying, what is an orchestra's role to make sure that a diverse audience feels welcome? I'll pose that question to you.
Sure. I mean, I think that's right. That's the heart of the matter here, right? So how do orchestras change everything? What they look like, what they play, how they present it to reach audiences and speak to people who they're not currently reaching. And so I think it's a question of experimentation and being willing to take risks and being willing to fail and change along the way. I mean, I think that's really the heart of what we're talking about.
Okay.
And building,
please. Oh, yeah.
Hire people of color who are currently coming out of conservatories and are ready to be employed right now.
I mean, isn't it a willingness to change everything? It's change who plays, it's change where you play, it's a change in what you play, it's a change in how you interpret. Right? If we're unwilling to change anything, then it's a problem. But if you say, well, you know what, we're willing to change all of those things. We keep going around, it's like, is it the musicians? Yeah. Is it the conductor? Yeah. Is it the person who runs the orchestra? Yeah. Is it where you're playing? I mean, you talked about going out to different communities, right? Because they don't have access to the Kennedy Center, right? So if we restrict this to temples that are inaccessible, guess what, right? So, I mean, I think all of it plays. You have to have a strategy that cuts across, I think, all the behaviors that any institution or organization has.
Yes. And there's a specificity principle in living system theory. So each orchestra in each community has to answer that question for themselves, specifically to that community. The answers for me in Philadelphia may not be the answers in Albany, may not be the answers in Phoenix. And so it is a relationship that needs to be developed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think for me that touches on something that I think we also need to examine, which is the very basic value system and some assumptions we have about how does the art experience happen. So, you know, I'm a conservatory grad. We're trained to believe that the composers are alchemists and they've arranged the tones in these specific orders, and when we, the musicians, with the support of our wonderful administrations, muster up and led by a brilliant conductor, and we get it just the way the composer wanted it, you, the audience, get to have this amazing experience. And to the degree that we get close to getting that recipe right, the greater your experience. That's kind of the operating theory of what everyone's talking about with the Cleveland Orchestra. That's sort of what they believe, right? That we make the recipes better than anybody else. And there's certainly truth in that. I still listen to the Zell Cleveland recordings when I'm getting ready to play Beethoven Symphony. That's still my standard, so I'm not throwing that out. But I do think we have to also look at, to what degree is the art experience also about cultural affirmation? And to what degree is the audience having an experience of cultural affirmation, and that is enriching their digesting of the art, and that it may not be as much about the alchemy of how the tones are arranged, but some of these other trappings. And so if we were to examine that and look for or intentionally bring other culturally affirming experiences into our concert hall, then we might find that there is no tension between sort of quality and quote-unquote diversity, but rather that these are, if we are willing to sort of change what we define as great art and why we think it is quality, and open ourselves up to the idea that it's not necessarily as much about the way I play a Schubert accent or where I put the grace note or delaying this beat in a Viennese waltz, that might not be as much of what is impacting them. That is impacting us on stage, the aestheticians, right. But that might not be impacting them to the degree as we think it does. Right. And crossing that bridge might open us up to a much easier way to have great art that attracts a greater number of people.
Just before we go on, I know we have to move to another question, but I spent many years working as director of community relations for the Chicago Symphony before I moved to New York, and one of the about making this experience more welcoming, one of the things that folks from various communities talked to us about was the other audience members who made them feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's work to do. Yeah. I'm not sure who has to do that work. All of us, I'm sure, all of us need to do that work. But how do we get folks who believe that it is their birthright to, whatever. So how do we get that experience to be welcoming and open and for everyone? And I think it has a lot to do with the audiences, and we have to do some work there.
Yeah. Un, I'm going to pose this question to you. It says here, 20 years ago, women were not represented in the executive and administrative leadership in arts institutions. What can we learn now about incremental progress there? Sorry.
Well, there is progress, but it's for white women, mostly. I think that's something that needs to be clarified. We were actually having a conversation about suffrage, because the suffrage anniversary is coming up, but it's the suffrage anniversary for white women.
That's right.
So, I mean, yes, there is incremental progress, and there will always be incremental progress because just the arc of history does turn in that way. But however much we can do so that we're really kind of firing the engine underneath that so that the gears are turning more. And I mean, that's why the Dream Unfinished is problematic, because we have talked in a previous presentation about how basically through erasure, exclusion, enclosure, and excuses, that is what has been pushing out Black practitioners of classical music. And speaking of enclosure, what that means to clarify is ghettoization. And the fact is, the Dream Unfinished ghettoizes, because we are thankfully performing works by Black composers that would otherwise, frequently not be heard unless it's by a Black Pearl or some of the other organizations that are here. But it's in the context of Black activism. And this music needs to be heard just anyway. It needs to be heard for what it is. It needs to be heard without this context of racism wrapped around it. And so that's why I will say that we are very much a small step in that incremental progress. And so that ultimately that there should not need to be a Dream Unfinished.
Francisco, I'd like to pose this question to you. I'll preface it by saying that not only am I a first generation college graduate, I'm a first generation musician, of any genre. This question says, does the lack of diversity in the arts start with the family?
The lack of diversity in the arts start with the family? No. I think every mother and father wants their child to be the greatest person they possibly can be. They sing at home. They act, they play, if there's an instrument around, they'll play it, whether it be a pot in the kitchen. So arts are in us. We are born with the sound of our mothers in our wombs. And that's where the talking drum comes from, the idea of coming out. So we grow from sounds. We try to imitate that sound from when we're born all the way through, and the voice becoming the first sound, and then the instrument following the voice. We take away the opportunity for children to have music because something else gets in the way. It could be the parents have to work and there's no one to take them to a music lesson and there's no one to take care of the other sibling, or it's just not cool because you're going to get beat up in the streets. Or maybe in your school, you have one music teacher that really can't read music so well, but they do their very best. Everywhere I go, there's music in every community. It is the one thing that combines us as human beings. But for some reason, somewhere along the line, we're told you're not good enough all the time. After a while, you start to believe it. You're not good enough. You play the piano, it's really good, but you're not good enough. And we take away those medals from the children. So diversity does not start at home. Diversity starts at home. The lack of musicianship is taken away by the people that they meet once they leave the home, in my opinion.
Just to add to this, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, but in 2016, the NAFME, National Association for Music Educators President, Michael Butera, he was on record for making a statement, to paraphrase, that Black and Latino children are incapable of musical excellence, specifically in classical music and keyboard skills and notation.
Yeah.
And the fact that the National Music Education Association for this country, their president could make that statement, points exactly to what Francisco was saying in 2016. In 2016. So just to keep that in mind, luckily, he's been asked to resign, but just to see how fresh and real all of this still is.
And if you go to other countries that do have what we would call people of color, they're playing instruments and they're singing just fine.
Sure, I just think that we should also bring up that there are a whole bunch of people who aren't in the room who would take issue with how we're defining the arts. And they would say that they see Black people and brown people and women and Asian people and all kinds of people in what they call the arts, and they resist and resent the way we sort of jealously guard these titles of what is the arts. And what do we mean when we say the arts, right? We mean well-funded arts where you can make a living and wear a suit and stuff like that.
We need more than that.
Fair enough.
We mean more than that. We may inadvertently mean more than, but we mean more than just well-funded.
Speak on it.
I mean, I think art is human expression. Again, we go back to what we've been talking about. So it's culture. We create culture. We are products of culture. We're creating culture. We're human beings that express it. So I mean, it's too big of a topic.
I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, no, we are, but it's too big of a topic to kind of just easily focus our conversation on.
No. The question, as I heard it, was speaking about a lack of diversity in the arts. And I was just pointing out that if we define arts the way you're defining it, there's not a lack of diversity in the arts. So I think we are.
Okay. But that's what I'm saying is, I mean, I think I'm trying to make the same point I made before with classical music. It's important we define what we're talking about first.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And I think we start to get into a place where we're putting a lot of things together and being head of an institution where there are many arts present, and one of the goals of the institution is to create new forms of art that no longer exist. So that it's difficult when we sort of ruminate in those spaces where this is defined and it's defined improperly, and then they're arguing. Sometimes those arguments happen. The arts are human expression. They play that role. I love the way Brian Stevenson talks about this. He says, for us in society to get through our problems, we have to get proximate with one another. We have to be in proximity to one another. And the arts, because they're human and because they're expression, are the best way to get you and me to be one right next to one another. And that's sort of the point, isn't it?
And historically, it was, in the late 1800s, that suddenly the invention of high art and low art sort of came around, and that was done on purpose. Right, that was done on purpose to exclude people, and so we have to dismantle the legacy of that notion.
And let me just say, without wanting to be in any way an apologist and appreciating that orchestras across the country have lots of work to do, that as the slide said, there are 1,290 plus orchestras in America, and some of them are not working on these issues, but many, many, many of them are in very meaningful and beautiful ways. I mean, just you're relaying how your orchestra has changed in 10 years and the kinds of places you're going and things you're doing. There's a lot of work still to be done, but I can assure you that this is totally front and center at the League of American Orchestras. Jesse Rosen, who runs that great institution, has been focusing orchestras on issues of diversity and inclusion and equity now for years. And while there's still an incredible amount to be done, as I look across the industry, and then also as I hear the reports and really encouraging things like Geralyn's inventing the kind of perfect orchestra that she needs because she can't find one that exists in the ideal form she sees it, there's a lot of really beautiful stuff that's happening that didn't happen 5 and 10 years ago. I'm not saying it's solved or everything's going to be fine, or that the terrifying statistics of of minimal black participation and Hispanic participation in orchestras doesn't exist. But I think there are a lot of very hopeful green shoots that are happening all over. Lee, you've been party to many of them, and et cetera.
Yep. I think we're running a little short on time. I'll ask you one more question, though. A question I had here was, what role does collective bargaining play in this conversation within arts and music?
Well, good question.
Add time. I have a lot to learn.
Look, I'll
take that one.
Yeah, why didn't that start there? Go ahead.
I'll say, collective bargaining is one element of the business model that is in the frame around the art form of orchestral music and what orchestras use. I mean, it's not, and that's all that it is. I mean, it's obviously it's an important part of our model because our musicians are central to what we are as institutions. I think, Alex, you kind of touched on this. I think we should also not shy away from the fact that we should be proud that we actually provide, great living wages to so many artists. I don't know many other art forms that provide the number of artists with the kind of lives that orchestras provide to so many musicians, and that's partially due to the construct of collective bargaining. So I think it's an input into the factor, but not more than that.
But I think Geralyn is able to create her ideal orchestra because she isn't party. She may have her own collective bargaining agreements, but she's not party to all the institutional baggage that comes with many of the great institutions, where you're really locked into certain, audition formulas that you can't break, etc.
Well, but those things kind of arose out of preventing abuses, I think.
Yeah.
And so Black Pearl actually, full disclosure, does not have a collective bargaining agreement with our musicians, but that's because I make sure I always take care of them and pay them very well. Even for education stuff, I pay them over scale, just to make sure, to your point, that education is not undervalued as a service by musicians, that it is equally as important. And so to underscore that, I pay them as though it were a regular performance, to make sure that they value the experience, both professionally and financially.
But that's a great example of a structure that has made its way into our collective bargaining that may be at odds with our values. And so I'm not blaming. It's not a fault of collective bargaining.
Oh no, I don't know.
But I think your example did bring up something that again, if we're willing to change everything, we're willing to change everything. It's like, why are education programs paid at a lower scale than a different program? And it's a great thing that you've done to say, well, no, because our values are such, we're not going to do that. And so, I don't know, maybe some places aren't free to make that decision. So.
Well, unfortunately, that's our time for today. There's a reception following, so we can definitely continue these conversations. I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center for having us. And I wanted to close today with 3 quotes from 3 musicians who have always inspired me. Nina Simone, "You can't help it. An artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times." William Grant Still, "I don't think that it's good for the world of music to have everything come out of the same mold. God didn't place only roses on earth, or only lilies, or only violets. He put flowers of many sorts and many colors here, the beauty of each enhancing that of the others." And finally, Duke Ellington, "My attitude is to never be satisfied." Thank you. Glad that this happened. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.